everybody. So good to see you and to have you here. Thank you for coming to join us today on a gray day in New York, but it feels like the sun is shining in here because of the energy and the warmth. It's why this is one of my favorite conferences ever. So today we're going to be talking about fighting unconscious bias and authentic leadership. And I'm so pleased and honored to have a distinguished panel of alumni. They're so impressive that I'm not even going to try to read their bios offhand, but they are in those handy booklets you have. But I'd like to introduce here with me our panelists, Anita, Rebecca, and Vincenza. So we have been talking about unconscious bias and leadership, and you can imagine how spirited our conversations have been. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little, and we're going to open it up for some Q&A. And I want to start by kind of giving you a roadmap for where we're going. We're going to talk about cognitive bias. We're going to talk about a pillar around authenticity, and then ultimately around empowerment. So my distinguished panelists, I want to sort of start by talking about the kinds of research that we're talking about up in Cambridge on campus. Bring you back to E62, which maybe wasn't there when you went to school, but it's there now. And there's a lot going on around this topic. So I want to share with you a little bit of the research that I'm involved with and others about cognitive bias and how it affects behavior. Behavior around leadership, behavior around decision making. So for example, recent research published a couple of months ago has shown that the brands that are around us, particularly high status brands, including high status brand names like MIT, organizations like NASA, like Charles Schwab, using products with these names on them and being members of these organizations can have what are known as placebo effects. You know what placebo effects are, right? Even though there's no active ingredient, it can change your experience. Well, in this research, we find that products and learning software with different names can affect how we perform when we're parts of those organizations. Other research has looked, for instance, at algorithms, algorithmic bias, algorithmic reliance, and the degree to which algorithms reflect and amplify cognitive biases that human beings have. And research that I'm working on right now, for instance, looks at who and when likes to get algorithmic input when making decisions, and who actually is averse to algorithmic input, and how that affects cognitive bias. So in thinking about cognitive bias and our behavior, there are sort of several hallmark cognitive biases that we talk about at MIT and beyond that I think are particularly relevant to this audience here. For instance, role incongruence. The idea that the degree to which you adhere to the expectations of your role affects the way in which you're rewarded. And a violation of the expectations of the role, for instance, of women, can lead to penalties that men do not experience. This image from the Portola Reporter in 1945 sort of really reveals how a woman should behave, or does it? Another cognitive bias is confirmation bias. The idea that you have an ingoing theory and you pay attention to the things that uphold that theory and really pay short shrift to the things that challenge that theory. And when we think about women in the workplace and leadership and being authentic, perhaps the image depicted in this cartoon may resonate. Sounds like it might, according to the chuckles in the audience. Bias blind spots. The fact that nobody thinks that they're biased, and everyone thinks that they're moderate. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with Jeopardy, but perhaps you know the answer to this Jeopardy? Yes. What is mansplaining for 100, Alex?
Let me explain it.
And And affinity bias. The idea that when hiring and promoting people, we have an affinity, a bias toward people who are like us. This person reminds me of myself when I was younger. And so that person is more likely to get the opportunity, which obviously makes it difficult when women and people of color are relatively new to the upper echelons of leadership. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we combat unconscious bias to change the way that other people view us, and indeed the indoctrination that leads to the way in which we view ourselves.
Well, I have a thought.
Please.
I could start on this. So how do we change the way others view us? When I think about that question, I think we want others to view us with respect and recognize our value and contribution. To me, it takes an incredible amount of self-esteem and self-confidence to speak up and constructively influence a situation, a negative experience, a coworker, sort of exhibiting biases towards others or in meetings and derailing projects or teams. And an example that I have that's pretty recent is that I've revamped my whole leadership team. And it's a great leadership team of men and women who work creatively, energetically, with just a lot of enthusiasm. But I noticed a situation where we had have a chief scientist on the team. He is a very well-respected, experienced person. And I noticed that in leadership team meetings, if I would direct a conversation or a question or a comment to him, he would turn and find a male person in the room and direct his comment or feedback or response back to the male person. So I'm thinking, I let that go for a few times because I thought maybe it's just me. That's a very common response.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's just me. But then I watched when other female leaders had conversations or directed questions too, and it was a similar thing. So I had to have that conversation with them because it was just changing the dynamics in our leadership meetings. And when I brought up what I witnessed, he said, I didn't realize I was doing that. So it's bringing the unconscious to conscious.
Yes.
And I wish I could say it was one conversation and done, but it wasn't.
It's not that easy, is it?
It's not that easy, and that's another part of dealing with these things, is it was one conversation, two conversations, three conversations, and okay, it's getting better, but we're not there yet.
Right.
And there's just one other point I wanted to make, because I talked about others viewing us with respect, value, and contribution, and how I think that's a key underlying thing here. I know it's always important for us to gain respect from our colleagues, from our senior leaders, but what I have witnessed and what I have found is that it's maybe a way of doing that so people can see value and contribution if there is bias around you, whether you're female or whether you're a minority or whatever. Gain respect outside of your immediate peer group. And so what I mean by that is, be active in professional societies, in your community, by publishing, by speaking, but show value and contribution around other things, and it often brings value and contribution and respect to you in ways people thought, oh, I didn't know he or she could do X, Y, or Z, and it often changes, possibly biases that you come with or that others come with.
That's interesting too, because it challenges
Yes.
the perspective, because you sort of experience different settings.
Exactly.
Which means that one setting can't completely devastate you because you've got your sort of irons, you're ironing different fires.
Or complete your whole picture.
That's right. It's
And
like a diversifying of your
exactly.
portfolio, so to speak.
So those are sort of two big
Business school
things that
professor.
I've learned.
Awesome. So Rebecca, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
So it's interesting because when I read the question, I really focused on how over the course of my career have I addressed the ways in which people may be viewing me as too young or too feminine or too loud or too bossy. And so in my head, I thought less about profound ways to address and actually transform people's thinking and more how to tactically address the bias that I'm likely facing. And one of the first pieces of advice that I ever received from a senior client, I work in client services, I was off in the corner at one of my first meetings, I think I was about 22, and I was scribbling notes. And she took me aside and said, let me give you a piece of advice. Sit in the middle, which Judy Lewent commented this morning she did in her class of all men. Don't take notes, and speak with a voice that doesn't sound shrill, sort of girly. Don't giggle. And so I think it was really important advice. I try really hard to sit at the table and have a place at the table, but also think about the fact that where I direct the teams that I'm working with and where they should be sitting is going to influence how other people in the room are going to perceive them. And so if I'm going with a younger woman to a male-dominated client site, which is typically what happens, I put them in the middle. I make sure they have a speaking part. I might, remind them that we're all going to be wearing suits. Don't wear something casual. And it's working from the visual and sort of your set of expectations that you're presenting to the world. I wish I didn't have to think about those things, and over time I've become more comfortable being girly and louder, and we'll get to that with authenticity, but I think it's an important strategy to take to internalize when you're young.
So I love that too, because I think it's really important when you walk through the door to hold it open for someone else. And so many of these rules that lead to success are unwritten. And unless you're from that culture or have a parent or someone who can sort of give you that inside knowledge, you could be committing gaffes and have no idea. And you could be torpedoing your career. And it's simply a matter of a gap in knowledge that seems to be tacit. So this idea of women giving one another kind of rules for success and helping them understand things that may have taken other people decades to ascertain, giving it to them earlier on is really, I think, an example of being an ally and holding the door open. And I'm sure many women here can point to mentors or people who've done the same, which is key to success. So, Vincenza,
Yeah.
I've been waiting to hear from you.
Okay. Well, a couple of concepts, and they were presented earlier in the day, but it's the ability to say no. And I think as women, we take on more than our fair share and try to do everything. And so I've made a conscious effort of wanting to be seen as an equal on my executive team. So taking on really high-profile projects, being able to say no so that I don't get into that overload type of scenario, I think has been instrumental for myself and has worked quite well.
That's almost a lifetime of deprogramming, though, that people sometimes have to do, right? Because girls are often taught at a very early age to be people pleasers. And so you almost find yourself overloaded, as you say, before you realize, okay, I need to set boundaries. And there's been research that has shown the sort of emotional labor that women tend to do for free in organizations, whether it be teaching other people about gender inclusivity because they take it upon themselves, or even research that has shown that controlling for the level within an organization, women tend to be the ones to clean up after the meeting, right?
Yeah.
That's right. So thinking about not just the way that people view us, but the way in which we view ourselves, I think, is really important. So this really brings us to authenticity, and I have to give Rebecca a shout out about this book that she kind of pointed my direction. It's called How to Be Successful Without Hurting Men's Feelings. So I'm going to share with you some images from this book and some other images that may resonate around authenticity. You know, the same comment from a man and a woman being sort of taken differently, speaking to that role incongruity that we talked about earlier, right? And, you know, finding a mistake and making sure you're non-threatening. When you say there's a mistake here, there could sort of maybe, if you want to kind of look at possibly maybe there's, if you want to, a mistake.
Don't forget, you're the numbers person.
Exactly. I'm just a girl, but maybe, you know? And then these rules that seem somewhat arbitrary, right? How exactly should I smile? I want to get it just right. Right? And so thinking about this and thinking about authenticity and how not only does it affect all women, but it affects particular women differently. Intersectionality. For instance, this quote here by Christiana I thought was really poignant, and the research shows that 50% of Black and Latina scientists have been mistaken for janitorial or administrative staff, right? And that African American women facing discrimination for wearing their hair the way it naturally grows out of their heads, right? And so this importance in understanding that the challenges that are presented to women aren't necessarily equally distributed either. And this challenge of authenticity strikes us all. So, I'd like to ask our esteemed panel, authenticity, what is it to you? And can you even be a leader without it? How do you navigate these seemingly arcane rules around being yourself, but not too much like yourself? Vincenza?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, it's a hard question, and over the course of my career, that has evolved. So it comes with confidence, and Ruby said it this morning, you have to know your skill sets and be comfortable with what you bring to the table and be the best version of yourself, not someone else's version of you. And that's difficult to do. But it's really, it comes with knowing yourself and knowing what you bring to the table and having that confidence as a leader to step up in that fashion. So, and once you reach that equilibrium, that steady state, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But then you also have to be open to the fact that that may change again, and you may find another skill set that you will want to incorporate and become, you know, the next version of yourself.
Interesting. So the skill set really giving you that confidence. Rebecca, Anita?
I think one thing you both brought up in the first topic is the importance of having the substance and the contributions to back up what you're doing in your job. And that will give you confidence, but it will also force people to recognize the value you're bringing to the organization, to your team, to the table. And so if you can continuously invest and demonstrate that you're a valuable asset in high-profile projects in ways that are developing and mentoring others, I think it then makes it easier for you to share your authentic self. I think people who know me from my social life and the people who know me from my professional life have very different reactions when I share feedback that I got at my job about being aggressive or having sharp elbows. My friends, particularly from college and graduate school that never worked with me on a team, are kind of confused because I have in my mother's voice going, would you rather be right or liked? And I always got the answer wrong because I said I'd like to be right. And my mother said, oh, you're supposed to want to be liked. And so I took that to mean at work and in school I was going to be right, and in life I was going to be liked. And now I feel like I can bring these things together as I've aged. I think my friends see more of my, no, that's not a good idea, I don't agree with your political position, because I know we've got the continuity of friendship to make it through those disagreements, and the people at work get to hear me scream and look at their engagement ring and run around when they have babies. So I've really appreciated that with the confidence and with maturity that I can then meld back the two parts of myself.
Anita, how do you navigate authenticity?
Well, first, what is it? I think it's a lot of different things. To me, I go back to our executive MBA class where we talked about principles. And so I think it means being principled to your beliefs. I think it means knowing and living your personal value systems. And I think it is an incredibly key ingredient for your career success, because I think you asked about that as well. So, for example, the real you, your values shining through, I think those are differentiators. They can help all of us to stand out, I think, in really positive ways. It's a personal branding of sorts. Another way that I think about it is it's the basis of building genuine relationships. So, for example, I think it's a way that you can connect with others, but more importantly also, I guess not more importantly, but also a way that others can connect to you. Mm-hmm. So, for example, bringing out the fact that you're genuine, that you're approachable, that you're trustworthy, that you're human. And so to me, I noticed when I take over new leadership roles, there's always this, can we go to talk to her about X or Y or Z? But when I can share stories about failures and successes, I believe that it does make me approachable and human and trustworthy. So I think about authenticity in those ways, and I think about how important it is to be able to have that and demonstrate that as a way of building your career.
That's great. And I feel like each one of you has an ability to convey that authenticity, just even on this panel right now. And that sort of it allows people to connect with you 100%, as you said. And it's so important for us to talk about not leaving that behind in order to achieve success. And then, of course, we have empowerment. So this is a heavily numbered chart. First of all, that checks a box. This is MIT, so we have to have some numbers somewhere. So check that. But actually, this is from some research that Rebecca shared, and I thought that top row of this regression chart was quite telling, in that in this regression, when we're talking about success here, female, the variable, is all of the coefficients have negative signs in front of them. So your gender, in terms of your attainment, in terms of your success, and particularly in the case of this table, your wages, seems to repeatedly, despite a number of controls in the table, lead to lower wage outcomes for women. And a sort of more popular example of this that's been in the milieu, the US soccer team pay gap, right? And the idea that these women's performance is superior to their male counterparts, yet their pay is pretty pathetic by comparison.
I just saw that.
The quality?
Off the...
Yeah.
Right.
If you saw that.
The quality of the team. So when we think about this and we think about empowerment, it's interesting that these wages are so low for women when the data show that diverse groups are quite beneficial. First of all, in groups, having more women and people from different perspectives, people of color, actually challenge the cognitive biases that kick in automatically and lead to higher quality ideas and to more innovation. And increase productivity when paired with pay equity. When people are paid properly, they're motivated, they're happy, and you're spending less resources trying to replace them. Research also shows that gender diversity in senior roles increases profitability. And moreover, that women score higher than men on 17 of the 19 most important leadership skills. This authenticity that we talk about, women may be predisposed to this and a number of other traits that really bring out the best in other people. Yet at the same time, the presence of women, and powerful people of color can trigger threat amongst dominant groups. Recent research has shown that in a post-Me Too era, as Rebecca shared, in a post-Me Too era, men are actually engaging in more behaviors that demonstrate gender bias or anti-female bias because they feel threatened. So, empowerment. How do we lead authentically when being our authentic selves obviously leads to better outcomes, yet sometimes creates threat amongst dominant groups?
I was sharing with Renée before this discussion an experience that I had with a new partner in the firm. There's about 50 of us, and I was tasked with going to a meeting in Canada with another woman. The two of us had been running a project, and a senior partner on the client had been invited to come to the meeting. And he pivoted the discussion to a man that I work with, a partner who's about 8 years behind me, and asked him to come and run the meeting. And to my partner's credit, he mentioned to me this had nothing to do with me, that this guy was notorious for preferring men, this kind of turning and answering the question to the man. And I said, well, come with us and let's figure out what we can do. And during the meeting, each instance that the male client raised the question with my male partner, the male partner would turn to me and say, Rebecca, how do you think we should respond? Or Rebecca can answer that question. And he shared that opportunity, and together we fought that bias that was happening with our client contact. And I think it behooves all of us to figure out ways to empower the people around us, to include everyone in the discussion, and looking to your male mentors to share that authority that they have, almost just for the sake of their gender, with you, and making it discussable in your own organizations will help you deal with the broader context in the environment that we're all interacting with. So I think it's on us to share it with the women behind us, but importantly also to share it with the men around us at all levels.
I think that's so important. Allies, right? We can't all do it ourselves, and we can be allies for others, and we need allies on our side. Vincenza.
Yeah. It's a hard topic, and I've had some similar experiences myself. And the most important is empowering yourself to really address the issue. And I go back to relating to others within the organization to build those bridges. And the only way to overcome some of these biases is really to empower yourself, permit yourself to directly address the issue and say, how do we all succeed? How do we create the right environment for others to succeed in the organization? Because if I'm feeling this way, others sense it too, and that's not good for anyone.
Right.
So let's talk about it. Let's together try to solve this, which is easier said than done, but it does work.
Absolutely. Anita.
I was, when we were preparing for this, I think on one of my calls, or after one of my calls, I thought, these are hard topics because I'm an engineer, and I can't engineer all of this, in my workplace. These are touchy-feely topics, but they're so important for navigating your career. And so I was thinking, well, how do we lead authentically? I think everyone here has talked about a lot of these. When you have a great mentor, male and female, you really learn a lot by observing great people, colleagues, bosses, mentors, and you take on and say, that's the kind of leader that I want to be. Also, we've all had them. When you have not the best influences in your career, well, those are learning opportunities too, because you say, I don't want to lead in those ways. So I think leading by example at work, in your community, and in your home. I have 2 grown sons, and you know, I know we all grow up with biases, but I think theirs, I hope, are very different from maybe some of the ones we all grew up with. And you know, what they saw is both hardworking parents, a mom and a dad, pursuing their career goals. And they never thought, gee, my mom should be doing this, and my dad should be doing this. You know, and I was talking to a friend last night, and she said, you know, share a quote. And I love the quote by Gandhi, be the change that you wish to be. And I try very, very hard for the new leadership teams that I bring in to inspire, mentor, give them opportunities, give them challenging projects, let them succeed and fail, because you learn a lot from all of those. So I don't know, I think those are sort of all the major ingredients to authentic leadership.
That's a good recipe. I think it's also important that each one of you has been very deliberate in doing this. You know, these sort of hierarchies and this stratification didn't happen by accident, and so it won't be solved if we kind of hope that it goes away. There needs to be deliberate and conscious action to make this change. So when we think about solutions and the work ahead, and this is work that each one of us has to continue to partake in, right? There's no free riding here. There are some strategies that we've talked about today and that research has sort of identified about using behavioral science or behavioral economics to combat this unconscious bias for truly inclusive leadership. So before we open to Q&A, I just want to leave you with a few bullet points to kind of keep these things in mind as you go out to do the work. The first is that research that I've engaged in and others really show that high standards have to be paired with inclusion in order for people to really perform their best, right? Simply having high standards and having quotas or numbers in terms of diversity is not the same thing as having inclusion, right? Where people actually feel included and valued in the culture. Without that, you see greater attrition rates for women and people of color, right? So it's important that that culture really be inclusive. Make the unconscious conscious to combat bias. Anita alluded to this earlier, right? The best way to combat unconscious bias is to move it from that latent area into the conscious area, and you're less likely to suffer from it. Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. There are many ways to practice this. Improv is one example. Asking people for feedback is another. Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable simply means that you're able to really take on these challenges and not let them derail you. Champion processes that decouple ideas and status. We all have probably experienced an idea that we proffered, not given the sort of the weight that it should have had because we're too junior, or maybe we're a woman, or whatever the case may be. If we can change the processes that decouple the content from the person who's offering it, in hiring processes, for example, in other types of innovation processes, then we can actually let the quality speak for itself, regardless of whether it comes from a woman. Deliberately embrace inclusivity as part of your leadership style. Our panelists, I think, have really sort of modeled this for us, right? By saying that they're actually looking to help people. They're being sort of deliberate about this and not kind of letting time just change this. And seek different kinds of support and connections. I really love Rebecca's anecdote about how someone who actually was junior to her allowed, himself to become an ally, which actually helped her ability to do her job better, right? People may be junior to you, may be senior, may be colleagues. We can have a board of directors, so to speak, that all play a role in our careers. And maintain intersectionality. Inclusivity is interdependent. Leaving behind any one of us makes all of us suffer. So hold the door open when you walk through it. Now that you have some tips and strategies, go forth. Extend a hand. do more than exchange business cards. Ask how it's going. I firmly believe that this space that we are in allows us to show vulnerability in ways that are not common to most conferences. Share it and go forth. Now, I'd like to leave you with an Audre Lorde quote before we open up. Without community, there is no liberation. So I want to thank my panelists for contributing to this community, and thank you all for being here. Before we have a big group hug, any questions? Yes.
My name is Silvia Ullo, and I'm glad to meet you in person.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Stand up, please. Okay, excuse me. Silvia Ullo. Hi to everybody. I have this question to Renée and the panelists. About authenticity, don't you think that to be or not to be authentic, it depends on the workplace or the kind of job that you do? My question is this: maybe in some particular jobs you can be authentic, this can be an advantage. In other kind of jobs, maybe to be authentic can be a disadvantage. Don't you think that it may happen, this?
Any responses to that?
I've found the sort of extent of authenticity to evolve for me over the course of my career. There were times where if I was my full self in certain circumstances, it would have led to us not getting a project, my not getting recognition, my not getting promoted. There were times when I was explicitly told my style was off-putting to senior people and I needed to think carefully about it. I don't find that adjusting my style to fit with my audience means I'm not being authentic. I'm still speaking my truth. I'm still sharing my ideas. If someone was aggressively treated by someone else in the room, maybe I won't interrupt in that moment, but I'm going to go check on that person later. So I think it behooves all of us to think strategically about how to change things from the inside and remain true to our core beliefs. But it doesn't mean that I should be as gregarious in one circumstance or as direct and aggressive in one circumstance as I might be in another. But you can still be true to yourself. If you're not, if you feel like you're constantly questioning yourself in your job, you may be in the wrong job.
Yes, authenticity doesn't mean unfiltered.
It was my thought in the sense that, your answer, I like your answer in the sense that I think that even authenticity maybe can be taught. Someone has to, to teach authenticity, to become strategic, in using the authenticity. This was my, observation. Because it's easy to say be authentic, but maybe it can be dangerous. So it can become even a topic to teach, to be authentic in a strategic ways. That doesn't mean to be false or not to be herself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So you talked about making unconscious conscious bias. More than once I've been in situations where I would point it out in a very polite and bringing humor in way, and very senior people in position of power would say, "You kidding me? I've never done that." Have you been in this position when there is just complete reluctance and pushback to accept that, and that giving them right to continue?
When someone is basically denied.
Yeah, like turning to you and, when you bring up a comment, turning to a male colleague, that was a good example, or any other body language, and you will bring it up to them and they would just refuse to own it.
So if I might offer something that's based on the research, people are reluctant to change, and they also have a tendency to want to jump to their own defense, particularly when faced with an uncomfortable sort of gaffe, or no one thinks that they have any of the isms, racism, sexism, isms. And as a result, it's far easier to change processes than it is to change people. So what that means is your energies and an organization's energies are spent changing the process such that no one individual is responsible for a sort of, the outcome of another. And we talked about some of the examples here. But my understanding is that process change and having an outlet for when there is such a situation that's not merely reliant upon that person taking responsibility needs to be baked in to the organization's processes so that people can feel like they can bring those things but not suffer for it. But maybe you guys have some other ideas.
I just wanted to build on the example that I gave before, which I think goes to something that you're talking about. I have tried to be, answering this question, I've noticed that my authenticity rises with my confidence in certain situations. And then this situation is related to that. When I saw that situation and I confronted my colleague, confront's that's not quite the word, but I really was concerned about the whole team dynamics, and I explained what my concern was. And I think at first he thought, I don't think I'm doing that. And he thought, okay, well, so she talked to me about it. But when I brought it up the second time and the third time with examples, and not just my examples, but what others brought to me, it no longer could be ignored. And I noticed that after the second or third conversation with concrete examples, and then us talking about, well, what are we going to do to change that in the next leadership meeting? I noticed that it's not all gone or all better, but certainly I think he's more conscious of it, and I noticed that he's really trying to work on this. So that's awesome. So don't let it go. Don't let someone off the hook the first time. If it's important, and all of these things are, to try in some different ways to make your point with examples, and maybe it will work for you too.
Yeah. Don't let it go. Don't give up. Now, it turns out we're out of time. I don't know how that was 45 minutes.
Yeah,
but
that went pretty. They cut off 15 of our minutes.
Yeah. But thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Really nice to meet you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.